When I was sort of updating my slides, I realized that we did this 363 days ago, literally. It brought back memories of the last time I was actually out of Austin, Texas, it seems. So anyway, we are virtually in New York City. Make a point that clearly there's an East Coast bias to the Biggie Tupac question. I'm just gonna make that point anyway. You all know what I do at UT Austin, and I also am the faculty co-chair of the Institute for Educational Management at Harvard in the summertime. So this is a topic I think about a lot. I research in this space, so it's really exciting. And I've had the opportunity to do a lot of work with a lot of mentoring programs in different foundations. So I think this is actually an interesting conversation I want to push with you. So I'm looking forward to that part of the presentation. So let's see. Okay, so those of you who saw me last year know that I love this app called menti.com. So if you have a cell phone, just direct it towards menti.com. The interactive code is going to be 7657903 for all the slides. So once you put that in there, every time you refresh, you'll see what's here. So you don't have to do it only but one time. Once you type that code in, anything I ask in the interactive slides, you can submit anonymously. So if you want to put something on blast, you can do that without being known. And I think it's a really good way to get people to sort of go there on some of these topics that we're gonna raise. So yeah, we'll do that. So I'm just making sure that people know how that works. I see somebody's already tried out and is testing it out, and it works. So that's awesome. Good job. That's the big thing about doing this sort of thing. And we're at a point in this pandemic that we're mostly used to using these interactive tools, but every so often there's somebody like, please help me, I don't want to do this, so I can see you're all savvy. And Chanel, thank you for putting that in the chat. So it looks like we all figured it out. All right, go on to the next slide. This is my overview. I have that sort of OCD tendency just to sort of tell you what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to stick to this mostly, partly to discipline myself, but also to make sure that you all know what's coming up. Really start with an acknowledgement, talking about intersectionality and mentoring, a little bit of a recap of the research and what we know about mentoring across identity. A tool I'm going to introduce to you that you may have seen before, but it's actually a really good launching point for conversations about intersectional identity. My former colleague, Terry Givens, has got a new book out called Radical Empathy, which I'm really digging. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. We're going to do a little breakout session, so a chance for people to talk in smaller groups. And then I want to focus on the fact that we are doing this work during a momentous time of social change and a pandemic. So how does cross-identity mentoring work in that space? And it's quite frankly something that I'm looking to you all to give me thoughts and perspectives on. I want to talk about sustainability in mentoring, because I think one of the benefits of having a research topic that gets hot, right? So when I started doing mentoring research in the early 2000s, people were interested in it, but by the time I was probably just approaching tenure, mentoring got really hot, partly because of My Brother's Keeper and the focus from the Obama administration on that. And I found myself talking to people in the media and in television and what have you about mentoring. And what I discovered is that there are a lot of like, let's do this intervention, we'll do this one thing, it'll work great. But they weren't necessarily sustainable models. So I want to talk about the sustainability of mentoring, because my hope is that the mentoring dyad or triad you're a part of is something that can continue and grow beyond the experience, right? It may not, but if it can, I think it's great. I've also been thinking about mentoring, nurturing environments. Like, where are the places that mentoring can take root? Because everybody wants to have mentoring. Everybody thinks mentoring is good. They espouse that. But not every place has the fertile soil for mentoring to take place. So I want to talk about that. Another interactive piece, and then something about collective work we can do on this issue. So that's what we're going to do. So let's go on. So land acknowledgement. Last time I did this, I was in Manhattan, so I gave a Manhattan land acknowledgement. So I'm actually in Austin, Texas, so I will give a land acknowledgement based in Central Texas. So I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting in the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, we would like to acknowledge the Alabama Kashada, Caddo, Carrizo, Kumacrudo, Colotecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. And I know we all have, we're in different parts of the country, so everybody can reflect on their own land acknowledgement from their space. So I just couldn't help but notice that yesterday was an incredibly historic day. And so the equality bill passed in the House. I know you were all busy yesterday, so maybe you were noticing this. But the equality bill will amend the 1964 Civil Rights Act to include protections for LGBTQ community members. Now, of course, the struggle is not over. It has to pass in the Senate, but it's pretty significant. And you probably have noticed, I'm not going to mention trolls, but a number of elected officials are now putting trans identity flags in front of their offices to show support and solidarity. So we could be at the precipice of an important moment. So let's hope that energy continues. So, cross-identity mentorship. And when we first started talking about that with Alicia and Fabienne and Irene and I started talking this long time ago, they were like, this is really important stuff. And it's funny because I think we all inherently know that, but I think sometimes we have to really make sure that folks who are just confused by this concept understand. So the first thing I think is, of course, something we've all experienced in the very intent of this mentoring program, which is historically marginalized and underrepresented populations have relatively small numbers of senior scholars in roles where they can mentor in homophilous arrangements. In other words, finding the, gay, male, African-American mentor that sort of fits your sort of homophilous sort of connection isn't always possible, right? Because A, there are a few people like that, and B, those people have a lot to do, right? And I was challenged recently with this term senior scholar. Like, do we use that term all the time? Is it sort of, hierarchical? And it is. I don't really know what a better seasoned scholar perhaps is a better way of saying this. But I also think it's important to identify the fact that near senior scholars, like people who just got tenure yesterday, move into this echelon very quickly. That happened in my experience, where literally I did not have that middle space to sort of be a formative scholar. I was instantly, once I made tenure, became a person who was considered senior. And what I mean by that, I had a lot of responsibilities that senior people had as far as mentoring and support and being a voice in the field, but not necessarily the same kind of developmental pathway that some other folks have, because, associate professors, if you look at the coach data from Harvard, they'll tell you the least satisfied group of professors are associate professors. And I used to think as an assistant professor that as a graduate student, I felt heavily burdened. As an assistant professor, I felt super burdened. I really felt it as an associate professor, because that's when the cascade of obligations come towards you. And then people say, well, you've already been promoted to tenured, so you should be able to do these kinds of things. But of course, many of us have goals beyond that. And I know some people who are like, look, tenure is what I want to get. I'm not really worried about what happens after that. But talking to actually a white male mentor of mine, he said, Rich, you need to be a full professor. That's really important. And he enumerated a number of reasons why he felt, as an African-American male, it was important that I had that sort of foothold in the academy. And I remembered that. And I said, I think you're right. And of course, ally and co-conspirator scholars can learn more about microaggressions and micro-invalidating experiences through cross-identity mentoring. It's one thing to talk about these things in the abstract. It's another thing to be intimately connected to somebody who experiences these things, right? In my own research, I talk about this concept of proximal experiences of being othered, right? When I talk to white mentors of African Americans, they often will relate a story. I'm a phenomenologist by training. So they'll relate a story in their life experience where they talk about being marginalized or being close to somebody who experienced marginalization. And in that discussion is when they talk about, that's when I sort of understood something else is afoot. It's not always apparent. It's not always obvious, especially things like micro invalidations and microaggressions, right? That's not what that person meant. that's not how you're taking it the wrong way. Those things that happen to us every single day, where we are basically told, you don't, what you're seeing is not actually happening. These mentors were like, actually, because I've had that experience, or because I'm close to somebody who's had that experience, or I've had something like that in my own life, I am very aware of the fact that these things do in fact happen. And of course, those who hold privilege and access in our spaces can work towards organizational and structural change, right? We should not be the ones always championing for change. It should be the folks who hold power and are in senior spaces. This, I'm not doing the ego thing here. It just happened to use that picture of me at a workshop. But I made this in Nature magazine, Nature, the journal, which I'm really proud of. Didn't publish, but I'm actually in it now. But a couple of years ago, I guess it was probably 2 years ago, probably at the same time we did this session last year, I was talking to a reporter, and she was like, I want to talk to you about this idea of the black tax or the brown tax. I mean, I said, oh, you mean cultural taxation? She's like, there's a term for it? I'm like, yes. Let me tell you about Amado Padilla's work on this area. And so I don't know what you all have had experiences with media. Sometimes it can be less than positive, but I adore talking to Virginia Gowen, because we actually had like several conversations walking her through what this concept was. And what was great about this article is that it became an international conversation, because she pulled in scholars from the UK and from Canada. And we talked about this sort of internationally. And what was really cool, this was published in June. So we were just sort of coming through the shutdown that we had done in memory of George Floyd and all the people who had lost their lives at the hands of the police. And we were talking about, well, what's the next step for the academy? And this article came out at that exact time. And so I got to see on Twitter and social media people saying, this is going to be a central part of our conversation. And I made friends with some of the folks who were in the article, just talking about what we navigate. And once you explain this concept, people are like, I get it, right? But it's amazing about how many white, cisgender, straight male, privileged faculty members don't understand what this is. They've heard that, they know that there's things that people of color, people who are historically marginalized do, but they don't really understand the impact until you start talking in these sort of broad ways. So I hope that continues, the conversation continues. I'm always reminded of this comment by Audre Lorde. There is no such thing as single issue struggles, because we do not live single issue lives. I absolutely love that, because when people say things like, well, as an African American, you must accept Z, I'm like, well, I have a lot of things going on in my identity, as we all do, right? And the whole point of intersectionality, as Kimberly Crenshaw articulated, is the fact that those multiple aspects of identity can work to limit our access to resources, to our own well-being, right? So I think it's a critically important part of understanding this. And yes, Fabian, we should make t-shirts, all of us, with this quote. So just to try out our mentee experience, I have a question for you. It's a short answer question. The question is, what aspects of your identity do you need your mentor or mentee to understand and embrace, right? And so it's open-ended, so feel free to put anything that comes to mind. So I'm supposed to take a look at the word cloud and see the things that pop up. And, I'm looking at woman, mother, gender as being ones that have repeatedly come up. right? I see also a couple of, and it's funny because you have to sort of in vivo code, right? Okay, so I see what looks like there's a focus on parental responsibilities, like being a mom, being a parent, right? I see that there. I see things like hidden, which are interesting, that there are aspects of our identities that aren't always at the forefront. Um, Helping the community, being first gen. So I think about the identities that obviously people either understand from our work or from our phenotype or from what we talk and say. But look at the centrality and the importance of family, right? And this means that you all truly understand mentoring, because one of the things about doing mentoring research is that people often think they're doing mentoring when they're not mentoring, right? They are sponsoring, they're coaching, they are providing role models, but they're not mentoring, because mentoring is the fusion of the psychosocial and the instrumental, right? So the idea is that you are doing things that speak to people's values as human beings. So things like family and life outside of work are centrally important, right? Um, as well as the job itself, as well as getting the grant or publishing the monograph or whatever it is you're working on. And so when I talk to people and they're like, well, we have a mentoring program, but we don't really want people to get in the personal realm of things. I'm like, that's not mentoring. Like, you have something else and it may be good, but it's not mentoring. So don't call it that, right? So anyway, this is interesting to look at, just to see and how people are talking about intersectionality, being Black and being a woman, being Black and being a man, sexual orientation, being an immigrant in first generation. Those things are super interesting. So you'll get to see this all, and I'll send this to all of you so you can sort of see how this looks. So let me just do a little quick recap of what we talked about last time, if you were here, about the mentoring across difference. And so cross-race mentoring, David Thomas is the GOAT when it comes to cross-race mentoring, as well as Stacey Blake Beard, who's my former advisor. And Kim Griffin and I have done some work in the space as well. And so when we talk about cross-race mentoring, one of the issues that seems to emerge is this issue of stereotyping, right? The assumptions that are laden from both the mentee and the mentor about what it is this person from a different identity is going to bring to the mentoring relationship, which is often a great place to have a conversation. What did you expect, or what do you think is going to happen when you bring together somebody who is cisgender and somebody who's transgender? What are the things that you're thinking about each other that you should probably talk about? And that's often done over a cup of coffee or whatever you like to do, and just say, like, look, here's what I thought might happen, or I think might happen with us, and almost confronting those troped spaces and being a chance to say, like, yeah, actually, that is probably going to happen because I do have that sort of personality tendency, or actually, that's not really how I think about these things. The identification and role modeling issue, right? So one of the challenges is that, can I be an effective role model for somebody who has a different experience than me? And my qualifying paper in graduate school was called "Ultimately, It's About Love." That was a comment. That was a comment from one of my participants. She said, "If you love the person, you're going to find the ways and the connections. And of course, because we're complicated people, we're going to find connections, even in just the things that we prioritize, right?" I love what we did, the icebreaker, right? So we got to learn that many of us have strong opinions about cereal, strong opinions about music, those kinds of things. So even if you don't have the same musical tastes, you understand that we all like those things and they care about those things. Concerns about intimacy. And this was really interesting because, in particular, I'm thinking about what happened with Black male faculty members who were mentoring white women. And when I heard these men tell me things, and it's actually true of all women, not just white women, but white women in particular, they were like, I'm very careful on how I engage in mentoring and what I do and where I do it. And at first, I'm like, these guys are full of themselves. What's that all about? And one thing that was shared with me was like, here's my concern, Rich. If I am ever accused of something inappropriate, I know that there are not societal protections or a presumption of innocence for me if that happens. And I remember this vivid example of a Black male faculty member. He was fairly young. He was working with one of his students, and the student got incredibly emotional. They had some kind of conflict. And the student started to cry. The white woman started to cry. He says, I got up and left my office. He said, I actually got up and walked out of my office. He says, because I just knew that that idea, the sort of social consequences of a black man in a room with a white woman and the white woman crying was not going to end well for me. And he was sort of traumatized by that. He said, from that point on, I didn't want to meet with students in my office because I was afraid that would happen again. And it didn't happen, to be clear, it wasn't a situation where it was a greatly emotional moment and they were sharing a bond. It was more like the student wanted something and the professor said, I can't do that. And she started to cry. And he said this felt manipulative to him, and he felt it was dangerous. So that's something to think about, that comes into the whole thing. And in a lot of cross-gender, cross-race mentoring situations, there is this idea of intimacy and sexuality. Jessica, you said it, yes. And one of the questions always comes up is, if mentoring by its essence is intimate, where are the sort of areas of danger? And of course, I was asked a couple of years ago to talk about what does it mean to mentor the area of Me Too? And I'm like, it shouldn't mean a whole heck of a lot, because if you're doing appropriate mentoring and you're respecting people's boundaries, you shouldn't have to change your mentoring style according to the gender of the person you're working with. That doesn't make much sense to me. And if you're doing things that you have to do that, you have to reassess your practice. Like if you're doing things that sort of suggest that I shouldn't do this in front of somebody who has a different gender or sexual orientation, maybe there's something wrong with what you're doing to begin with, right? And that was the point I made. And I talked to a popular press media outlet about this, and they thought that was funny, I guess. But I was like, well, no, I mean, I think everybody's different, but we don't get sort of stuck in these spaces where we do things that are so problematic they can't work in other spaces. It's also a form of gatekeeping, right? When you think about, well, we do this work in these spaces where these people, exactly, at least you're talking, I'm talking about, how problematic that sort of framing is. Perhaps you should do the same things consistently, and that would actually alleviate that problem. So cross-gender mentoring, as I said earlier, the issue of sexuality and intimacy, I mean, that's always an issue. People talk, people say things, people make assumptions. And that's something that cross-gender mentoring diets have to think about and talk about. And of course, harassment and unwelcome behaviors. Again, this issue of intimacy. It's very hard to talk about this because I want people to have intimate connections with mentors, but I also want people not to be exploited or harassed. And one thing I think is always important is to just have very clear discussions about where the mentoring relationship is going. Always having those conversations, making it part of your practice to talk about, hey, how is this working for you? Do you feel things are working the way they should? Should we cool it on some of the things we're doing? Should we do more stuff what we should doing? Those kinds of conversations are really important, even though if they sound awkward, because you're constantly gauging where you stand. And sometimes it might be like, I'm going through a really hard time in my life right now, and maybe it's not the best for me to engage on this level at this time. That's really important to say that, rather than sort of go through the experiences and then finding out from experience, like that's not what we should be doing right now. When I talk about mentoring with queer identifying faculty and the folks who are not queer identifying, the politics of being out are really important, right? So, I was talking to a colleague of mine who's director of LBGT studies at UT, and she said yesterday, I have colleagues who are only out to a handful of people, right? They're senior scholars, they're established. The idea that there is some kind of professional consequence to being out may not appear to be there, but for a variety of reasons, they're not out. So if a queer scholar is sort of advancing in a certain space and they're looking for people who have similar experiences, they may not be apparent, right? So that's something to think about. And receptivity and support, because of how, and it's so important in this moment. And not to return to something I think is pretty unpleasant, but I will talk about this. When Marjorie Taylor Greene puts up a poster in response to the representative, I forget her name, who puts up the transgender flag because her daughter is transgender. That kind of stupidity, frankly, ignorance, limits the ability for people to see the person, right? Um, I'm obsessed with some kind of consequential judgment about your being, and I can't see you. And that unfortunately exists in the academy as well. We cannot pretend that we are all enlightened beings in that respect. One space of mentoring I think is really interesting is mentoring for people with different abilities. And that's something that's often not discussed, right? Because so many parts of our of ability are hidden, right? There's consequences for discussing your ability status. If you have mental illness, if there's consequences. I remember, I might have told the story last year, but I don't know if I did or not. But I remember a story about a professor at my university who has scoliosis, and he talked about the experiences he went through. And I brought to my students just to see if they respond. These are first year students. I didn't know they respond to it. But two students said, I'm just so glad that somebody who teaches at this university is talking about this, you know. And nobody, said anything, but I suspect that they were like, as a person who has a disability or live with disability, I think it's important to hear people who have, accrued some steps in the academy talk about this, because I don't feel like I'm alone. I feel it's possible. And I reached out to that professor and sort of said, I really appreciate the courage you showed by doing that, because I know it impacted other people, right? Um, and of course, cultural taxation. For the people who have the courage and say, I'm working, I have a mental illness and this is how I'm sort of working with it, then they are all bombarded with all the people who have similar challenges or want to talk about it, right? So that's another way that people feel that stress and that strain. So anyway, that's just a recap of some of the stuff we talked about last time. So many of you have probably seen something like this. We call this the identity wheel. And it's an exercise I use with people usually when we're first sort of broaching the topic of identity, right? I think Fabian, you said this yesterday, or maybe it was Alicia, but the idea of putting your mask on first before you help others. You can't be effective in this work if you're not connected to your own lived experiences, right? And so if you walk around ageless, raceless, sexual orientationless, how can you really be effective talking to people who see that as central to their identity? So we have folks go through this wheel of identity. We give them a couple minutes to work on this. And we ask them things like, well, what parts were easy to identify? What parts did you just put down on something and move right on? What parts did you have to think about? What parts would you like? What are you talking about exactly? What do you mean by this? And when I do this in a big group setting, I often get the hand coming up and saying, so what do you mean by this term right here? Like, which indicates that that's not an identity that a person has to sort of deal with the social consequences of. And of course, some of these they mutate, right? So age, there was a one point in time where I used to be able to say things like, as a young person, I feel I'm not taking this seriously in spaces. That's not as true anymore. Even though I still find myself in some spaces where I am the youngest person, I'm almost 50. So that's a problem, right? Why is that happening still? Socioeconomic class is a good example of this too, because many of us come from a working class or a poor background, but now we are at least income-wise in a different space, but we're still socially oriented to seeing the world as a working class or a poor person. And if y'all saw me at the thing, I don't let anything go to waste when we go out to eat. It's coming home in a doggy bag for me. That's part of how I grew up. I can't let that go, right? But at the same time, I have to grapple with the fact that, wait a minute, those aren't this, I can't sort of appropriate that experience completely because I don't have those same constraints. It's in a lot of ways, it's something I have to grapple with. And frankly, probably one of the biggest challenges I think in my professional life is the fact that I do not have that identity as much anymore, but it still impacts how I see the world and how I interact with it. So this is a great discussion point, just to have a conversation about what did you put there? How does it connect to our conversations? Do we have things in common? Do we have things that are different? Are there things that you don't think about that I think about constantly, right? And I use the term socially consequential impact, right? So when I do this exercise with people, sometimes people say, well, I like to fish. It's a huge part of my life. And, there's no place for that there. I'm like, yes, But is being a fisher, an angler, a socially consequential identity? I suppose there's some place you can make that argument, but for the most part, no, you're not going to suffer because, or you're not going to experience oppression because you like to fish, right? But you may experience oppression and social sanctions if you love somebody of the same sex, right? That's something that needs to be discussed and understood. So let me talk a little bit about what Terry Givens says about radical empathy. And I love this quote she has. She says, radical empathy is moving beyond walking in someone else's shoes and requires taking actions that will not only help that person, but also improve our society. And so she gives a 6 steps, basically, what it means. First of all, a willingness to be vulnerable. And in mentoring, that is the key. I talk about trust being the cornerstone of mentoring. Vulnerability is part of that. Being able to express, here is a time when I came up short. Here is something that did not work well for me. Here's something I'm still struggling with. It's such an important part of building trust, right? Becoming grounded in who you are. I said earlier with the identity exercise, really understanding where do you hold privilege, where are you oppressed, right? And how that interacts in your life is really important. Opening yourself to the experiences of others, right? I say this a lot to my colleagues who hold multiple levels of privilege. And I say, how many times are you in spaces where you're not the dominant group, either numerically or in power structures? And if you're not doing that on a constant basis, as a reminder, I think you lose some of your humanity. I think you forget what it's like to be in a space. And I do this a lot. I'm invited to talk to a lot of our white male fraternity groups at UT Austin. And I make that point to them. I said, you can have an experience where you traverse this institution and you are never, ever in a space where even temporarily, you are not in the dominant power group. You're not the numerical group. And when I tell them to have these experiences, I say, you can't be voyeuristic about this. Please do not go to the multicultural center and just sitting there kind of hanging out. That's not what I'm talking about. But I do want you to have experiences where you work on a committee and maybe the committee is all women or all people who identify as LGBTQ, and you're one of the people who's not, because that helps you to build this empathy reserve, right? The practice of empathy, actually thinking about and doing things to assist people who are experiencing oppression. And if you know anything about ally sort of frameworks, there's the idea of standing behind people, standing to the side of people, and standing in front of people, right? That constant positioning about how can you leverage your identities to assist people. And of course, taking action. And of course, creating change and building trust, like actually using that positionality to change structures, right? It's nice to be a good person. It's better to create good systems, right? So now we're going to do a breakout. And I want to ask you 2 questions. We're going to do about 8 minutes or so. And I want you to think of a space when you're, as a member of a dyad, I know we have a couple triads here, right? So as a member of that dyad or triad, where is a space when it comes to identity or engaging where you have a strength, either through experience, your own empathy, or your knowledge? What can you say, like, I do this really well. I feel really comfortable in this space. And then conversely, I want you to talk about a space or a topic that you feel vulnerable. Perhaps you don't have experience, you don't have knowledge in the space. It's something you just learned about recently. So I want to have a dialogue with, or not a dialogue, but a conversation in the breakouts where you talk about, as a mentee, as a mentor, I feel I have this really well figured out because I've had this experience, I've done this work. And maybe a place where, I feel less secure and less prepared in this space. So when we do this, I want people to sort of think about who in the group will be willing to sort of share some takeaways when we come back together. So Vicente is going to break this out into groups, and then you'll just hop into those. I'll probably pop into 1 or 2 just to be a gadfly, and then we'll come back and talk about that. Sound good?
Opening. Groups will have 4 people each. Opening now.
Sounds good.
Sorry,
Andres, that was perfect timing. Wow.
Same in our group. Jenny had just said, just finished a sentence and is like, oh, That worked
It's like,
perfectly.
yeah, like, wow.
See, we've been on Zoom way too long. We're too good at this to adhere to the various sort of cues when you know it's going to end. Like, okay, now it's time for us to shift. Hold on one second while I pull up my screen. I have to make sure. Okay. And you all can see my screen now, right? Great. Okay, well, welcome back. And I always have to apologize because I know it's never enough time to have a real, a deep conversation. But nevertheless, hopefully it sort of generates some grist for the mill when you go into the dyads later on today. So I would like to ask folks just to share what you discussed, and feel free to be as direct or as vague as you like. But I'd love to hear just people unmute themselves and talk about what came up in your small group. What did you talk about?
So Richard, I'm going to jump in, and if I can, is that okay?
That's great, Vincent.
So, so first thing I'll say something a little bit about process. So one, I think it was a little bit hard, and I don't think it was just the time. And yeah, we could have used more time, but I think sort of getting our group together to sort of really address these issues, it was sort of interesting to me that it took us a little bit of time to kind of get there. And then we ran out of time. But I think folks were more comfortable with strengths. I think I heard a number of strengths. I heard ability to be really empathic and to be an authentic listener. I heard, the ability to provide feedback that's constructive. I think sort of an interest in working with mentees that are highly motivated. So those were a little bit easier. When we got to our second question about the places that we struggle, I think I started to hear in the group, and I certainly was part of the conversation as well, that there's some challenges when we have a mentor or mentee that's difficult, that has a different worldview, that is facing barriers that we feel that we're not able to address, and so we don't have the expertise. When we're concerned about some of the things that you brought up, Richard, earlier in the sort of didactic part, what if I say something and they react poorly? I think that's the place where we were kind of struggling, and I could see us as a group trying to find comfort, even in our small 4-person group, of how we could kind of get into that.
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. That's really reflective, to hear about just how, it's difficult to talk about the aspects that are challenging. And then I think our natural instinct is to say, well, I shouldn't have places where I'm not good at doing these things, but we all do. We all have experiential spaces where we just don't have the resources at this point. Maybe we will get them, right? But we don't have them right now. Another group, maybe share some reflections on your discussion.
I'll jump in because I was the note taker for my group, and we discussed some really interesting strengths, and actually also weaknesses. So, when some of the strengths that came up were being a strong advocate of students and intervening in spaces of institutional hierarchical power. Another, it was thinking of students holistically and beyond just like the research and the grades, and checking in on them to make sure, that they as mentors acknowledge that students have lives outside the work. And someone said very, I think, insightfully, like bringing their own vulnerability into mentoring relations helped foster that relation and help the mentee. And in terms of weaknesses, there were some really good ones. One was creating the sense of being unapproachable because they work very long, demanding hours, but not because they expect that of other people, but then that comes across as being hard to approach. Being a slow reader of students' work, and then reading with a lot of detail to give great feedback can sometimes also put students off because they're not sure when they're going to get the feedback. And then from the point of view of a mentee, not demanding enough of their mentors or not asking of their mentors in the kind of right way. Also overcommitting and then finding it difficult to actually deliver, maybe giving the sense that you're unreliable when you're doing is actually wanting to help a bit too much, maybe.
Andres, I feel seen by the things that those are all things that describe me, a slow reader, overcommitting. Those are all things that I certainly engage in, and I think you all did a great job of sort of positing the natural tendency to want to support students holistically. I think that's really important. I have actually seen and observed, and I've talked to people in my work about, well, you know, people in my department say things like, I am here to help you understand physics. I am not here to help you understand how to, you know, get to grad school, something like that. You know, I'm not making exactly what it was said, but basically something like that. And colleagues looking at those people in horror and saying, well, that's the job. You know, you're not a Khan Academy. You're actually a living, breathing person, and you can interdict and you can say things and you can give advice. And yes, we want to make sure we maintain appropriate balance. One of the things I think about a lot is like, sometimes there are people in our spaces who should not be engaging in mentoring in a deep level because they're just not good at it, right? Because they say things like that. But sometimes is that something that people do because they do it because they know it's going to sort of turn people away? And what does that do to the people who actually engage in the work? It creates more responsibility for the group. This is probably the one duty in the academy that being an asshole kind of provides you the ability to sort of provide yourself more time, right? If I come across as being a complete jerk to people, I should put off enough people and spread that responsibility to other people. So the people who can really deal with my sort of jerkiness get a little bit of the benefit, but I'm generally insulated from not doing it. And I've witnessed this, I'm sure you have too. People who usually use that as a way to sort of move people out of their mentoring periphery. Thank you. Another group?
I can share for our group. We also had not that much time to get into difficulties, but some of us did. I think we talked a lot about particular frames that we are each have been focusing on introducing into our relationships. So one of our group members talked about really making space for thinking about varying levels of ability and making spaces more accessible, just because at different times in any of our lives, we might have increased needs in certain areas. So really prioritizing that. We talked a bit about class and how in graduate school or elite spaces, there can be a lot of explicit conversation around race or particular identities, but not room for these intersecting ones. We also talked a bit about gender and really centering that. And I guess like one theme that I could say came up is that by focusing sometimes on one particular lens really closely, you can forget about other lenses that are really important and remember to introduce them in our everyday interactions. So if anyone else from my group wants to add, feel free.
Allison, that was great. It actually reminds me, I got an email recently on a discussion on Black LGBTQ folks for Black History Month, and sort of talking about the erasure of Black queer folks in Black history. Like we do a lot of discussion and we talk civil rights. We don't talk about the involvement of Bayard Rustin and others who were purposely marginalized in that effort, and the responsibility of particularly Black lesbian social critiquers, who often are, that part of the identity is erased, right? So this idea that sometimes we look at a aspect of identity, but we sort of push to the periphery the other intersectional aspects, which I thought was really powerful, because, you know, and it's not done in a way always that's purposefully marginalizing, but it ends up being that way. That's how people experience it. So I love that you talked about the importance of that. And so I love it when folks sort of quote unquote disrupt sort of narratives of sort of, you know, our community has all the same things going on, And like actually in our community, there are folks who are experiencing things differently because of this aspect of identity that intersects with our racial, ethnic identity. And sometimes that's lost and forgotten. I remember from doing a study, talking to a Black faculty member who's identified as queer, and made the point like, this experience is doubly isolating. And the importance of having one colleague leaving the university and how it literally created ripples through the entire community of queer folks of color in that town, because that person was not just a academic person, but they were a social, they were the person who had parties, they were the person who organized things, and that person was gone, and it created this vacuum. And they said, well, quite frankly, the white queer community is not the same. It's not a place that they felt comfortable in. Great point. Another group, perhaps? This is really good.
Our group actually had trouble thinking about strengths at first. And like the other groups have said, it really, like for us, it was a really difficult conversation for such a short time. I wish we had more time so all of our group members could have spoken. But one of the things that one of the group members, when she described her area of difficulty, I actually pointed out to her that was her area of strength, because she was saying how like she's moved from like different states and like different areas, and that she hasn't been able to like build community in those places, and so she doesn't feel like she's deepened those connections, and so like she doesn't feel like an expert in anything. And I said, oh, but like actually I think that's a strength that you have, that you're so adaptable that you can just pick up your stuff and go to a new place and get a new experience. Like I wish I had that, because like I've lived in Florida my whole life. Like I've never picked up my stuff and moved. And so I admire that by you. And so maybe that is your strength. Maybe that's your area of expertise, is adaptability. And then she was like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And so we started talking about how like sometimes we're so focused on our deficiencies that we don't realize that there are strengths. So that was a big point that we made.
I love that. That's so well said, because it actually was something that we ended up talking about, and Pamela, I'll talk a little bit about what as I'll do is sort of concept of borderlands identity, right? Or Willie's concept of marginality, right? If you are constantly at the intersection or the nexus point of multiple identities, you may not feel comfortable in all those identities, but you are conversant in sort of transgressing and moving across those different boundary spaces, and even being comfortable with discomfort, which is sort of the story. If I do a autobiography, it would be called Comfort with Discomfort, right? Just knowing that there's always this space of liminality where I'm like, do I really fit here? Oh, I'm close enough. Or, you know what, I don't, but heck, that's the way it's been for quite some time. I'm used to it. I think many of us, Vivian, I see you co-signing on this, like, academia is a great place like that, right? Because we can get to these very sort of discrete communities of practice where everybody's read the same thing and knows the same information, and you don't read the same things. And so does that make you less of a part of that community? Or do you bring a strength in the fact that you have a different sort of lens of how you look at the issue? That is certainly how I've felt in my experience in so many parts of my career. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And also the fact that it takes people to help you reframe some of the things that you might see as vulnerabilities or weaknesses, and say, actually, that's something that would speak to somebody else's experience. Fabian, you got to get the email blast in the morning so you know what the headlines are at least, and you can fake it. Another group? Can we hear from somebody else? And just know that we don't have to have every group report out. I just want to make sure if there's an opportunity or an interest that we allow people to do that.
This is Lance. I can share.
Sure, Lance.
Yeah. So in our group, we discussed a range of things. I kind of want to just sort of focus on some of my comments because I want to allow others to speak about their experience, just because some of the things that we talked about, I think were potentially sensitive. And so I think one thing that I reflected out, I think, well, I'll say like our group basically collectively, we sort of focus more, I think, on identity and the intersection between identity and scholarship and how it shapes your scholarship and how, for me in particular, some of the topics that I study have to do with questions of identity. And so you end up drawing, I have a couple mentees who I kind of work with, and they have a similar sort of focus, and it's based sort of on their identity, right? So I understand what it means to experience micro-invalidations or microaggressions in a particular gendered, racialized and gender way. And also in terms of sexuality. So I can really speak to that, or I can reflect that, or I can mirror that. I can sort of understand how, you know, for instance, a man of color who is also gay walks through the world. However, in terms of my weaknesses or blind spots, I've also had encounters with students who who may not share the same gender identity. And so I guess one thing that I mentioned in the group that I feel like I want to examine more closely as I move forward is, you know, as people share their experiences of gender with me in the academy, wanting to be a little bit better, a little bit sharper in terms of responding to their experiences, because, you know, how people move in the world, you know, and the way they experience the world is also happens in the academy, right? But their experiences of microinvalidation, microaggression, is going to be sort of filtered through their own experience. And so I can understand, you know, microaggressions and microvalidation, for example, from my own perspective and my own experience, but it could look different for someone else. And so to me, like, I'm just reflecting a little bit back on what you said earlier, Richard, about sort of, I think one of your participants talked about his own experience and just trying to sort of like strike that balance of being supportive, but also thinking about his positionality as a Black faculty member. And so how do you do that? I guess that's the heart of it for me was, you know, how do you sort of strike the balance of being responsive, being empathetic, but then also just sort of like being mindful, right, of your positionality and how, you know, you can maybe be mischaracterized, right? Your response could be mischaracterized or misunderstood, or be characterized in a particular way. So that's kind of just one thing that I really focused on. But I want to create space for other people in my group to share if they feel so inclined.
I would just say, Lance, you just identified, I think, sort of the crux of what we deal with as scholars, that we work in spaces of expertise, right? That is, what is the one thing that nobody ever wants to experience? What is the worst thing that can happen to a scholar is to have your expertise questioned, right? Whether it's because your work's not academically honest or the results don't work, whatever it is, right? That's the thing that we're almost frightened of. And what it means is that maybe that means that we're less vulnerable or less willing to be vulnerable, right? And what you described to me is only going to be accessible through trusted relationships where both the mentee and the mentor have opportunities to grow. Every so often when I have an interaction with somebody and they're like, oh my gosh, you know about this. And I'm like, well, there was a time I didn't know about this. There was a time where I had to ask somebody who was trans, help me understand a little bit more about your experience in a way that didn't feel exploitative, right? We all know the culture vulture experience when people are like, tell me about you so I can write this down in my notebook and, you know, have some talking points. And nobody likes to do that, right? And certainly many of us have played that role because we know it's important and we're willing to sort of be that pincushion to sort of give people some talking points so they don't make complete asses of themselves when they go into spaces. Like, let me just give you a couple pointers when you talk to people of my community. Don't do that. Don't say this, that kind of like that. Because we're educators by nature. Many of us do that. But of course, there's a certain point where we have to sort of go through the experience of just becoming trusted and sometimes being checked, which one of the things I've really appreciated over time is just the times I've been lovingly checked by people I care about. And it's like, yeah, Rich, that's not it. That's not what you need to be doing. Like, oh, really? Help me understand that. I'm like, oh, okay, that kind of thing. And I will tell you, one example I use all the time is misgendering people. That's one of my biggest sort of fears. And sometimes I lapse into behaviors that are just, my own biases, and I have to be checked. And I'm fiercely apologetic, but at the same time, I have to work in the space of self-forgiveness and say, I'm going to do better next time. We don't have many spaces that allow people to do that. So I'm looking at Alicia's question. What about the tension between protecting mentees from the assholes in academia, but not being overly paternalistic? I think those are the kinds of things that are judgment calls. And there are certainly moments in my mentoring practice where I felt like I should have intervened, right? The intercessory role of mentors that Charles Willie talks about. When do you walk into a space and say, I'm going to take all the heat and all of the stuff that comes with that? Sometimes that limits the ability to learn, right? And I think we have to make those own judgments, even tell people, in real time, is there something you want me to do that would be helpful in the space that would sort of help us navigate this experience in a way that you feel supported? But I also think there's advantages, or there's a perspective about you going through this experience and you sort of directing the whole thing. I'm here to support you however you wish. And I'm reminded of a time when I was talking with a white male faculty member who was mentoring an African-American woman. And he said, she started talking to him a lot more about sort of micro invalidations, like going into a space and being talked over and those kinds of things. And he said, listen, I have thoughts about this. He says, but I also think that perhaps my world of view and my world experience might not be the thing you need to hear right now. So he says, do you think that we should call in a good friend of mine? He explained who this friend was and what she had done. He said, would that be a good conversation? Do you want me to be in that conversation as well? Do you want to have a conversation with her one-on-one? What do you want to do? And he said he kept on giving her opportunities and options and thoughts. And when she asked for him, well, what do you think I should do? He says, well, how about this? So he tried really hard to make sure that he gave his mentee the opportunity to sort of guide that direction. So I think in that particular case, the first time they met with a colleague, they met all three of them together. And then the next time they built a relationship. So they met other times. But I thought it was really cool because it required him sort of, and he said to me out loud, he says, like, I didn't want to be a mansplainer. I didn't want to be like, well, what's going on is this. He's like, I don't want to do that. He says, I might actually end up doing that. So I think I want to bring in a colleague who I think would be much more insightful. And initially, that's how they started. They started with the three of them talking, and then the African-American woman who was a more senior scholar ended up being another support for this young woman, which I thought was great. But I mean, honestly, this is a great question. I don't necessarily know if there is a determinative, but I think a lot of times it's important to debrief and break down those experiences and like, well, I didn't do this thing, or I don't want to do this thing because I think this might be the outcome. What do you think? And having a chance to respond to that. I think a lot of mentoring work is being able to reflect and forgive oneself, right? It in a lot of ways, it sort of parallels the experience I have as a parent. I fail constantly in this job, but I have to sort of forgive myself and try to do better in my next attempt. And that's not making a connection between parenting and mentoring, but it's the same sort of self-forgiveness that is required. So I just want to hold space for a second just to see if anybody else wants to share their group process. And if we don't, we can move on, but I just want to give a few seconds to see if anyone else wants to share. As you saw in the chat, I am a former fourth grade teacher, so I know how to wait. All right, we'll move forward and we'll have more time, I think, at the end to have discussion. So thank you for that. Thank you, everybody, for sharing and talking about your group process. So this is the thing that I was thinking a lot about in the last several months, really, is just like, okay, mentoring across difference presents challenges and opportunities, for sure. But when it's a moment that has such great social consequence, when we think about Black Lives Matter, what's happening among our LGBTQA community members, what's happening politically in this country, and a pandemic that has disproportionate impacts on different communities, right? So how does this work in that environment? And so I have a couple of thinking points, and I think we should spend more time thinking about this, because there is already the discourse that, hey, by June and July, pandemic's over. Hey, great, we're doing good, you know? And it's not going to be that way for so many folks in our community. It's just not. I mean, there are going to be cascading impacts of the pandemic, coupled with, in fact, you know, I was just thinking about what I'm seeing happening right now with a number of Asian American activists who are making the point about the disproportionality of violence directed towards Asian Americans and Asian people in the world generally since the pandemic has started. You know, so then how do we account for the time and space that we need to be vulnerable and build trust? And I'll give an example of this. You know, I have talked to a number of colleagues who do work like I do in universities, and they're like, you know, we had plans to do something this year, but, you know, budgets are tight. We're not going to be able to do those kinds of things, right? And that's going to be a refrain that's going to be heard quite a bit. We don't have the resources because we've lost time, resources, et cetera, to do the work, especially in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, right? Which already diminishes trust in communities that we didn't have strong trust to begin with, right? And so what I've tried to point out to the powers that be in my institution is that this is not the time to sort of let up on those commitments. We've got to make strong arguments about why these commitments are important, especially at this time. Because if you understand the disproportionality of both social injustice and the pandemic, those communities in particular are most at risk. What are we doing to actually reinforce and buttress the work we do in those spaces? And we already had a trash reputation to begin with, right? One of the things I've always explained about working in a predominantly, traditionally, historically white institution is that we do not have equal reputational, you know, capital in communities, right? There are some people who bow down at the University of Texas because it's great, and there's some people who think it's utter trash, right? And can give examples from loss of property, you know, lack of engagement, and so on and so forth, to lack of access, to say, this is why I don't think that means that much to me. And oftentimes the people on this call are the people who are making those inroads and making those connections and building those relationships. So yeah, I think that's often misunderstood. Then how do we discuss the issues of disparate impact? Our experience differ. And I'm thinking about what happened here in Texas last week with the power outage and the situation we dealt with. And of course, everybody from everywhere else in the world is like, how did that happen in Texas? But, you know, myself personally, I didn't lose power. I didn't lose water. My family was safe. Extended family was safe. And I know 40% of my neighbors in my community were not. They went through varying stages of discomfort to, you know, health risks. And you probably have heard some people even died. That's just a microcosm of what's happening right now with this pandemic, right? And again, I understand the urge and the desire to get back to normal. Totally get it. But as I've talked to a number of activists and people in communities, they've said things like, look, if we go back to quote unquote normal after this, then we haven't learned a damn thing, right? The ability to really question what we consider to be normal is really the question that we have to grapple with as scholars, as community leaders, as community exemplars. We have to think about that. And then of course, what are the long-term impacts we'll experience? So at my university, we are doing a number of things to sort of assist scholars in sort of moving their agendas forward, right? And a lot of that has to do with applying for monies and programs and these kinds of things. But even the experience, the ability and the bandwidth to do that is constrained, right? I know personally a couple people who didn't apply for those things. They don't have the time to do it. They are literally trying to manage family and their own health concerns and their own structural concerns, right? It's sort of like, even when we try to help, the help isn't always accessible to people. Yeah, I love that, Robin. Same water, but not in the same boat. Some of our boats, are just having a little bit of water in them, and some of our boats are literally sinking, right? And my question is, how do we co-conspire to support one another? How do we eschew the sort of, oh, we're back to normal? Like, I'm already hearing that discourse in my university. Fall 21, back to normal. I'm like, it's not going to be back to normal, especially for the communities that we purport to want to serve better. So something to think about. I hope we can all sort of examine how we can do those things better. So, I'm serving on a sustainability committee, and, I was not quite sure why I was selected to do this because, I think about sustainability in the environmental sense. And I'm like, I try to do the right thing, but is that really my wheelhouse? And what they said to me was like, yes, but we think about sustainability across the whole life course, not simply in the environment, but sustainability of impact, sustainability of culture, all these things. And I love that. I'm like, oh, this is cool. Because I was talking to a group of students recently, and they said, how do we sort of convey our concern for the environment to communities that historically have not been part of our conversation? And I'm like, you have to broaden that definition, right? You can't just simply say it's about driving a Prius. It has to be about things like environmental justice. And it has to be about centering those concerns. I'm from Austin, Texas. I went to school right next to a tank farm that was leaking benzene into the soil for about 30 years, right? So those kinds of issues matter to people, right? So I think sustainable mentoring practices center self-care and reciprocity. Like, you have to be the person who is able to find, and in fact, a piece I wrote a few years ago with some colleagues about, it was called Self-Care for Diversity Educators or something like that. And we talked about the fact when we recruit people to be, in the space, we had to absolutely make sure those people did not fall into traps on, as far as, not taking care of themselves. I think also networks and communities of support rather than going it alone are super important. I think being able to courageously confront conflict, to have resources and how to do that, respecting boundaries, because not everything is open. Even when you are in a space that's intimate, not everything is going to be accessible and should be accessible. And of course, remember what mentoring actually is, which is attending to your psychosocial instrumental needs. So there's that. So as we transform our communities of practice, I want to ask a question. Where do we have influence? We have influence in our programs, in our departments, academic units, our societies, and social media. We have influence in those spaces. Who are we co-conspiring with? I use that word rather than ally, because to me, that's much more directive and much more dangerous, right? It truly is talking about structural change to co-conspire. Who will invest their time and treasure to advance our causes? Who can we mentor and sponsor and serve as role models, right? We're in a sort of continuum. We're being mentored. We're also doing mentoring and vice versa. What are the networks? And then what are we actual material needs that we actually need to do the work, resources? So I know I need to wrap up, but I just want to make sure we get to this point really quickly. I want to give a checklist of mentoring, nurturing environments. And this could be your department, this could be the field, but these are the places I think we need to be thinking about when we think about mentoring, nurturing environments. Espoused values, actually saying that mentoring is central to what we do, right? That's the first piece. But then, of course, we support that through training, communities of collaboration, and consultation, right? And time, right? Resources are available, time, travel, funding, right? Those kinds of things that support the ability to do mentoring work well. Mentoring is an expectation. Understanding there's a variance in, who can do what, and temperament. We don't want everybody mentoring equally, because some folks we all know are not really well suited for this work. Are we recognizing exemplary mentoring? Are we finding ways to recognize and honor people who do the work well? Do we have conflict resolution resources for challenges in mentoring? Do we have ways of people, this is not working, who can I talk to? Who can give me support? And then of course, the networks, we talked about yesterday the hidden curriculum, the networks that are accessible and processes are transparent. How do you get to this place without being, having it hidden away or opaque? So I want to stop because I know we're at time, and I always have way too much to share, and I'm sharing the slides with you for sure. But are there any questions or points of discussion that folks want to, and Alicia, I look at the chat to tell me how much time you want me, how much more time that I can use. But I just want to open up to
10
anybody.
more minutes. 10 more minutes.
So let's spend the next 10 minutes just sort of engaging in questions, thoughts.
Is it okay to stop the screen share, Rich?
Sure, you can do that.
Just
I only see your little windows. I don't get to see all of you. That's better.
So Rich, one thing that I'm really sad about and feels like it's unfair is that there are people who are not good at mentoring, right? And they get to duck out of some serious lift in terms of service, right? And that on the one hand, I'm like, oh, thank God you wouldn't want so-and-so involved in this. On the other hand, it just pisses me off. And then on the third hand, if I had three, I'm not getting recognized for the fact, right, that I'm doing something pretty valuable, right, for the institution. So I'm just thinking about ways to, like, as an economist, I'm always thinking, like, what are the incentives, right? And I don't know if anyone has any examples of institutions that pay for, not pay, but, like actually value mentoring. Like, it's a part of your service. Like, they call it mentoring, not just like, oh, you have a student, right, that you work with. So that it's recognized as a service lift and maybe is offset with, like, do this committee for the provost thing that actually the assholes would probably be really good at if they would do more of that, right? And piss off the provost and, advocate in an aggressive way or something. I don't know if anyone has any good examples of that, but I'd love to take that back to my institution.
So Alicia, I'll share something that I think happened after the last time we got together. Maybe it did, I don't know, but so the University of Texas, the provost launched something called the Distinguished Service Academy. And so we have distinguished teaching academies and those kinds of things. We have teaching fellows and what have you. And so they announced they were launching an academy of folks who had distinguished themselves in service. And I was not involved in the planning process of this in any way. And I did get an email saying, Rich, you should apply for this. And I applied and I actually was brought to the inaugural cohort. The cohort is 5. I'm the only male in the group. It's all women of color and queer women and me. And so we all said for the first time, the institution recognized us both by honor and, like, financially putting us in this exalted group. And the funny thing, of course, is that part of the Distinguished Service Academy is doing more service, right? But it's service that we kind of figured out. We actually, because we were the new ones into the space, we decided that we're going to apply and sort of, like, I'm going to talk to the Distinguished Service Academy about this being an outgrowth of the work that we do. Like, I don't have to do a program specifically for that group. I can do this as a member of that group, right? So we've been talking about the ways that we count and our work is actually validated. And all of us sort of, squeaked through, and I guess in a lot of ways, the academy, because we found ways to have things count in multiple ways. Like, if you're going to be part of a community group, can you create research out of it? And can you do it in a way that's not exploiting that community? It's hard to say, but we all did things like that. So I think those kinds of spaces are important. So institutions should all have these kinds of recognized spaces for people who are exemplary in the work they do. Carrie Ann O'Meara at University of Maryland, College Park, has really good work on sort of social loafing and work distribution in departments, right? There are ways to sort of chart who does what work. And to your point, Alicia, we don't want everybody doing the same amount and same kind of mentoring, but we also should have expectation that, can you at least, be part, like when I finish this session, I'm going to go to a admitted student days program we have at UT Austin. Those are the kinds of things that any of us can do. They don't require an incredible amount of skill. And perhaps the more intentional, intimate work can be done by the people who favor it. But I love what, Danny was sharing in the chat about this point system. I don't know how it works, but I think that idea that we all have different strengths and interests, and we should be able to use those to a certain extent. Not completely, we would never say somebody in the academy should do no research, but should do all the other things. We want a modicum of that work, but then we also want to see you in other areas too. So somebody could perhaps be an exemplary researcher and do a modicum of mentoring, sponsoring, coaching work. And that should be an expectation for all of us. That's just my thought. I'd love to hear other people's reflections.
Maybe Richard, I could just add that I think this last conversation speaks to when folks are in administrative roles, how important, or in faculty senate and things like that, how important it is to leverage your positionality and your influence to try to create change in whether it's promotion and tenure criteria or incentive systems, so that as you get, so that the people in those positions to adapt and change the institutional criteria, practices, norms, are thinking in these ways about how to prioritize mentoring, reward it, or community engaged scholarship, or all of these other things. Like, these are created by people. Hopefully they can be changed by people.
It's a great point. I agree. This is the piece I was talking about, how do we leverage our positionality? And the charge I have is like, there are so many mentoring sort of enclaves and spaces in the field. Should we collectively come together and start talking to the folks at Woodrow Wilson and the folks at the Society for Friends and Research, and say, where's our collective stance on this? What do we need to do collectively as scholars from very different spaces about the centrality and the importance of mentoring? Like, I think it's time for that kind of push internally to come forward, and not just sort of be in sociology or in history, but from all disciplinary spaces. Because I'm in a lot of these spaces. I get to talk to a lot of people, a lot of different foundational spaces about mentoring. So it makes me think that this is not just happening at WT Grant, it's happening everywhere. So what are we doing collectively? And what can we do collectively to really impact, as Vivian's talking about, these promotion and tenure processes? So there is actually, we want to know what you've done for mentoring and supporting others. Like, what have you done in that space?
Richard, in the last minute, can you answer even just quickly Caitlin's question? Do you have any guidance on mentoring through traumatic times? Like if there's an instance of police violence against Black communities, or there's new legislation that restricts LGBTQIA rights, as examples? Yeah, thank you. I was typing something. I was like, this is gonna take too long to type. So here's the thought. One thing that I think is your institutional context matters. And Vivian said something really important about administration. I'm an administrator now. I am learning the constraints of the role I have. The things I would say 2 years ago with relative impunity, I don't get to say those things the same way. I have to work in spaces where there are constituents who don't agree with my perspective. But I've always made this point in my integrity, is that human rights are first and foremost. I will argue all day long about the centrality of human rights. And I will argue against anything that diminishes human rights, right? And so one thing I think is really critically important is to hear. A lot of times I had this happen to me recently. I actually felt the need to sort of say, wait a minute, we're doing all this work and you don't see it, so don't be so mean. And I'm like, no, actually, we need to hear this, and we need to have people, with, all the ire and frustration come out and say these things.
And then we need to also apply ourselves in ways and be in conversation with the people who are critiquing our institutional structures. Because I think it's a two-way street. A lot of, I'm in the middle of so many things at UT Austin, and a lot of the students are in spaces where I can actually help them understand if institutional change is what you're striving for, here are ways we can make it happen, but it's not going to happen quickly. But it can happen, and it's going to happen because sustained, intergenerational, different spaces, different strategies working in sort of some kind of cohesive way. And I'm actually educating people in the space I work in. I work in higher education. I'm a higher ed scholar. So this is how these spaces work. But I think we should definitely tone down our defensiveness, because I think it's our nature to say, wait, we are doing a lot of things that are important and supporting communities that isn't always seen. But there's a reason for the anger, because the work hasn't moved fast enough. And I think just being in spaces to validate those experiences, and also letting people know that those critiques are welcome. And it's hard sometimes in the roles that we hold to make things happen effectively. But I always want to be in conversation with people who are finding the work that we do is lacking. I don't want to ever be out of that conversation.
Well, everyone, thank you. Thanks, Richard, and everyone, please join me in giving Richard a Zoom hand clap as we do. Thank you.
Thanks,
so
y'all. I
much,
really
Richard.
appreciate
That
this.
was
I always
great.
enjoy having this conversation. So I will jump out, but I'll jump back in later in the day. So I look forward to seeing folks